Hi, I'm Brett Heasman, a researcher in the Department of Psychological and Behavioural Science at the London School of Economics, and you're watching an online version of a presentation I gave at the Aut2Engage conference, hosted at King's College London and organised by Dr. Laura Crane and Hannah Pickard on the 23rd of February 2018. If you'd like to find out more about this event, look up the hashtag Aut2Engage on Twitter. The event was held to discuss participatory research in autism, and I was invited to present about an exhibition I have created called Open Minds, which was designed through discussions with the community I had been researching. Open Minds had the goal of promoting autistic perspectives and improving public understanding of autism. Although the original presentation was recorded to be available afterwards, I actually had some difficulty on the day of presenting, since I hadn't slept the night before and I was very nervous. This meant that I lost my way a few times in the actual presentation and omitted many important details. I also answered the questions following the presentation very poorly, so this is my chance to correct these mistakes with the magic of technology. So, let's begin. This presentation will cover three things: why I did Open Minds, how I did Open Minds, and most importantly, what I think I would have done better knowing what I know now. Why do Open Minds? My motivation for doing a public engagement activity of this nature originated from my experience of being a carer for Campbell, who is autistic and has severe learning difficulties. Every day we would walk through town together, and on some days I was surplus to requirements because Campbell knows the route inside out and walks very fast to get there. On other days, however, the journey would become impossible without my intervention because there are a number of features about his environment that could become problematic, such as loud engines, parked cars, and people waiting at bus stops. What was clear to me was that on a day-to-day basis, Campbell's autism did not change, but the environment did, both in terms of the sensory aspects as well as the people, groups and norms he encountered. This ultimately determined whether walking to his learning centre was an activity he could achieve independently or required help to do so. So already before beginning my PhD, I began to imagine how a public engagement project to improve public understanding of autism could be really beneficial. When I began my PhD, a lot of the participants that I interviewed told me the same thing. They said that they feel autism is deeply misunderstood and misrepresented in society. So apart from further validating why my research was important, I began to question whether there was more I could be doing as a researcher to help the people I was studying. So my motivation for doing Open Minds was very organic, and in fact I'd never heard of the term participatory research when I began the Open Minds exhibition. But now I have had time to reflect on the wider role of participatory research. I can certainly think of at least two very good reasons why everyone would want to use this as their default approach for understanding autism. First is the moral and ethical motivation, which Damian Milton has written about very eloquently. The knowledge produced about autism is not separate from how autistic people experience the world. It is a constituent part of their social reality. It will go on to shape clinical practice, diagnostic criteria, policy. It will also circulate into popular culture, shaping the media, films and TV. And most importantly of all, it will filter into interpersonal relationships, shaping how non-autistic people view and extend possibilities for interaction with people on the spectrum. With that kind of power and responsibility, it is imperative that autistic voices are not excluded from the process of creating knowledge about their diagnosis. A second motivation is to do with validity. If you are not participatory in some element of your research design, then it's easy to end up with a closed system of knowledge exchange, which over time becomes detached from the real-world challenges autistic people face. Regardless of the type of research design used, at the very least, researchers should be making efforts to take their findings back to the participants and the communities they study, especially translating it into accessible forms, because this will enable them to develop the best leads for future research. For this reason, I think it's important to recognise that participatory research is not a methodology that researchers can step in and out of, but rather a philosophy about how you study and work with people. So what is Open Minds? I wanted to create a public platform for autistic voices to be heard, because they are there, they're just not being listened to. I also wanted to illustrate the diversity of what this word autism entails, particularly given the overarching stereotypes that dominate popular culture. I therefore needed some kind of public exhibition space, and importantly, I needed to make it interactive in order to draw people in. My idea was to team up with a professional photographer, Lydia Meredith, and take portraits of people in the community I'd met during my research. While doing so, I would interview them at the same time, and then connect the interviews to the portraits via MP3 players. In this way, I could replicate an interpersonal dynamic by allowing autistic voices to speak directly to members of the public. I could also create a whole series of portraits to give a window into the diversity of autistic experiences. This was the plan, but how could I make it happen? Well, the first thing I had to consider is what resources I have that I can mobilize. Sometimes it's easy to miss the things that you bring to the party as an early career researcher. For example, I'm good at writing. I'm especially good at writing applications. This comes in handy when you consider that I also have institutional access to a variety of things, such as comms teams, creative spaces, people, and funding pots. Now, funding in academia is strange, because in general there is not a whole lot of money, but there are lots of little pots of money that can be accessed, so I really recommend pairing yourself with someone in your institution who knows the system well, because this will enable you to maximize the success of an application if it is directed at a specific fund. Finally, I also have the power to network by virtue of my institutional status, even if I'm really bad at networking. This makes it easy to approach people and get a conversation going by simply saying, "Hey, I'm a PhD researching this area, let's talk." So these elements came together, and I identified a particular type of fund that would enable me to get my activity going. This was a knowledge exchange and impact fund internal to the London School of Economics. My next challenge was how to structure my application. There is no shortage of frameworks for structuring participatory activities, particularly because of the ref institutions have a need to measure and document their impact. For me, I used a toolkit provided by the Knowledge Exchange and Impact team at LSE. Such toolkits are designed to drill down into the specifics of your idea and get you thinking about how you can deliver on what you set out to do. For example, I had to think about what my proposed means of engagement were. I had already come up with the idea of talking portraits, and I had also had the idea of creating a website to store all the material from the exhibition online. This was important because it was one way of ensuring longevity of the project beyond the event dates of the physical exhibition itself. But beyond that, I had to think a bit more creatively, particularly because if I'm doing a public exhibition, I needed it to be interactive, and I did worry that people would get saturated with having so many perspectives to listen to. One idea for creating that interactivity was to team up with Becky Liddon, the founder of Sensory Spectacle. I'd met Becky before, and we had floated the idea of doing an exhibition. Becky creates installations for helping people to imagine sensory aspects of autism. This was a great addition to the exhibition. I also had other ideas, some of which I was unable to implement. For example, I had the idea of recorded talks and workshops, and also even developing an app so that users could experience the exhibition in different sensory ways in real time. But as I will go on to explain, it was not possible with the resource constraints to follow up on all of these ideas. Another thing to think about is the types of audiences to be engaged with. All audiences can be broken down into different types of stakeholders for which your event may appeal to in different ways. For example, some of the stakeholders I was engaging with included the academic community in terms of enhancing the knowledge economy and sharing cross-disciplinary methods, people on the autism spectrum in terms of bringing together different voices, building connections and empowering their voice, and there are also organisations such as charities, as well as individuals, including parents and carers. Another consideration is your criteria for success. When I began my exhibition, I was thinking mostly in terms of societal impact because, as I mentioned before, I wanted to increase public engagement with research and improve public understanding of autism. But other types of impact exist, including policy, economic impact, academic impact, and capacity building. So do think in terms of these other types of impact when structuring your applications. So, what happened? Well, I applied for the fund with little expectation that I would have success, but I was successful and they gave me £2,000. My challenge though was that this was confirmed on the 10th of January 2017, and I had already provisionally booked the exhibition space for the 27th of March 2017, so I had under 3 months to create an entire exhibition. One of the first things I did was I went to the ESRC, who funded my PhD, and asked them to match this funding under the terms of their collaborative grants. They thankfully agreed, which meant I then had a pot of £4,000 to do the exhibition. So in a very short space of time, I had used my institutional access, my ability to write applications, and my research networks to find participants for the exhibition. I was surprised at how quick it happened. Now the reality check. What were the barriers that I found myself facing? The first was to think critically about the design process. This is very important. Although the exhibition was derived through conversations with autistic adults, and in terms of structure involves no interference from me as a researcher, but rather a direct link between the voices of people on the spectrum and members of the public, you still have to think critically about the design process. This involves constant updating and adapting your plans as you work with autistic people. For example, not everyone wants to be photographed or look at pictures of people's faces. One way in which we worked around this was to have participants volunteer objects meaningful to them instead of having portraits done of their faces. For example, in this picture we have Joe, who volunteered his Lego to be photographed. We also had to make sure the photographs were done in a comfortable location for participants, so this involved many house visits and trial and error in terms of finding a scene or pose that the participants were comfortable with. It was also important to give plenty of advanced warning about the day of photography so that participants can get used to the idea. We had a few participants, for example, who decided on the day that they did not want to do it despite having agreed to do it before, which is why having time here is very important. Autistic participants had total control about what to talk about when interviewed and how to be photographed. All digital copies of the photographs were also shared with participants as well. Managing the skills and budget was also a challenge, as I was moving from the field of academia to the field of event management, which I have much less experience in. £4,000 turns out not to be a lot of money, not when you factor in all of the costs. For example, venue hire, designing captions, signage, event insurance, installation, de-installation, van hire, printing and mounting portraits, website, design, audio equipment. It was also very important for me that I would be able to invite people who had participated in my exhibition to actually attend the opening reception and meet visitors in London and also give speeches, and so I had to budget for this as well. To work around some of these challenges, I centralised a lot of the labour on myself, so I learned a whole bunch of new skills. I learned Adobe Illustrator, Photoshop, Premiere Pro, After Effects, Audition. I also helped to install and transport the exhibition. Another challenge was capturing diversity. From the very beginning I was faced with the task of trying to do this, which was a challenge because I am only one researcher. I really struggled to find autistic women to be part of the exhibition, for example. Also, Hull is not a very ethnically diverse part of the country. To work around this, I emphasised that this was just an exploration of one community in all of the material associated with the exhibition. I also incorporated a recent report called the Autism Dividend Report to give some wider context. Diversity of experience was another challenge. I was worried that visitors would get bored or saturated with so many perspectives on show. Becky Liddon's installations helped. I also created a video about my experiences of walking through town with Campbell, with hazards in his environment identified. This provided a really accessible way for participants to understand the themes of the exhibition. I also created an augmented reality app that users could experience the exhibition through their phone as a window, literally a window into sensory experiences, so that, for example, faces on posters would become blurred and non-social features would become more animated. This was not an efficient use of my time, because in the end I had to abandon this idea. It would be clumsy to implement and would not stand up to the rigours and detail of what people expect in a public exhibition, particularly if you promise them augmented reality experiences. A final challenge was resource constraints. Everyone in academia is already operating at maximum capacity. Finding time and space to do something new and labour intensive is a real challenge that has to be navigated. My supervisor is very supportive, but I knew that he was concerned about the progress of my PhD, and pitching this idea of the exhibition was going to make him uncomfortable. I knew the exhibition was going to detract a lot of time from my PhD, and I didn't want to increase his anxiety. I think this reflects one of the realities of doing participatory activities. If you're going to do it, you need to be all in, which is a real challenge for the life of an early career researcher who is likely to already have so many other deadlines to work to. The exhibition met many of the goals I had set for myself. The opening event was a great networking opportunity, bringing charities and organisations together. It also led to a future exhibition at East Riding Theatre in Yorkshire in conjunction with a play about autism that they were doing, which brought the exhibition to a whole new audience. The resources for the exhibition I made are freely available on the internet. The video of walking through town with Campbell is being used by a number of local charities and local councils as part of their autism awareness training. Associated media with the event, including a promotional video from LSE, has been viewed over 10,000 times on social media, helping to get the message out there, which in itself starts to become a type of intervention. I gathered data on visitors through a questionnaire, which then formed the basis of my impact report. People reported that the exhibition had really made them question their default assumptions about others, and had also led to greater empathy for the challenges autistic people face. They also reported that they loved the interactive nature of the event, and they would be interested in attending further events. Where to from here? This is important to discuss because I thought, perhaps slightly naively, that there would be a snowball effect from the exhibition. Changing that many people's default assumptions about autism, and doing it in a way where they were really able to engage emotionally with autistic perspectives, I thought would lead to more people becoming involved, more attention, and consequently more resources to take this idea and do it on a bigger scale. But that hasn't quite happened in that same timescale that I had planned. One of the reasons for this is because I project managed everything myself and created much of the content. When I stopped, the project stopped. It was inevitable that after the exhibition I had to return to my PhD to catch up on the time I had missed, which meant that my resource constraints eventually caught up with me. Despite this, I had planned for such an event, which was why I had created the website to maintain the digital experience of the exhibition. One of my plans was to continue to add more stories to the database as I encountered more participants in the future. This would allow me to address the diversity issue of my exhibition. I still intend on doing this. Another idea I had to keep inertia going from the event was to produce an impact report. So I managed to get 51 visitors to the exhibition to fill out the questionnaire to provide feedback on both quantitative and qualitative aspects of their experience. This was a great thing to do, and I have used the report many times since. But in the immediate aftermath of the exhibition, I had hoped the report would bring more immediate attention to the work I had done. What I learned is that institutions are very keen to show impact, but their timescales for change might not align with your timescales for change. And so this is something else to consider when doing these types of activities. What would I have done differently? There are a number of things I've learned from this experience that I believe could have improved things. For example, I wouldn't have project managed on my own. I would have tried to get more individuals involved, especially those with experience in event management, but also other institutions. Also, the event was slightly rushed as I had 2 months between having my funding granted and the exhibition opening, so in hindsight I would only agree to doing something like this when you have a considerable amount of time to plan and prepare. I would also only want to do a participatory activity where there are appropriate contingency funds in place. Finally, I would consult resources such as the Research Councils UK, who have a number of pathways to impact case studies to learn from. One limitation of existing frameworks is that they are very good at detailing within event strategy, but are less clear about how to transition from one event to another, particularly when the initial project is exploratory and may not know what its end goals are from the beginning. So, in conclusion, I do think that in general we are witnessing a paradigmatic shift in how autism is understood and researched, and that the early career researchers are going to be at the frontier of this shift. Participatory activities are vitally important, but they are also a challenge given the resource constraints that early career researchers, and indeed most people within academia, have. But despite this, it's important to see the opportunities that exist outside of the normal expectations of being an academic. They are particularly important for research on autism, which involves so much diversity, because we need far more diverse ways of engaging with this population. Hopefully you will have learned from my very honest assessment of this project. My hope is that all early career researchers engage with the participatory spirit, because it will help clear the path towards the biggest intervention of all, the one that changes society itself. Following my presentations, I had a number of questions, which I didn't answer very well at the time and I'd like to pick up here. The first question was about the identity of the researcher and how this is disclosed to potential participants when engaging in participatory activities. This is a very important question because a fundamental aspect of doing such activities is building trust, and this becomes difficult and problematic if one party, i.e. the researcher, is withholding information. I think it's important that researchers be as open as possible, although it is also true that the researcher may be unable to disclose their identity for a number of reasons. For example, they may not even be sure what their identity is. This particular discussion was taken forward in a following panel at the Aut2Engage event. A second question I had about the exhibition was whether there is a paradox between turning autistic perspectives into objects that are looked at, which in one sense may be doing the opposite of the intended goal of the exhibition. Again, this is an important question and speaks to why the design process has to be iterative and truly participatory. My key objective for the exhibition was to create an interpersonal experience, which is why the portraits were interactive and not standalone images. Many visitors to the exhibition were deeply moved by standing with a portrait and hearing its voice speak to them. In this way, the portraits were very dynamic. It was also important to be clear that they came directly from the community without any interference from myself, since autism has typically been described from the outside by neurotypical academics. Also, the opening event invited members of the community I had researched to come to London in person and deliver speeches about their experience. So again, it was a very interpersonal experience in many different ways. Finally, I was asked about people's reactions to the exhibition. As the impact report highlights, it was a hugely positive experience for visitors. People felt a huge amount of empathy towards autistic people, particularly because they often did not realise the scale and scope of discrimination that autistic people face on a daily basis. I think this is an important point to make. On the whole, most people want to be more inclusive and to support people with disabilities, but I think in terms of autism they just don't know how. This might be because they struggle to imagine what sensing and perceiving the world differently must be like. Or it might be because they are so rooted in particular norms of doing things that it is hard to imagine alternative ways of interacting. Beginning to break up these default expectations is possible though, when encountering the rich diversity of autistic perspectives, particularly through interactive design. So, that was my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I hope very much that it has been helpful in your own research endeavours. I will put a number of links into the description below so that you can explore things further. Good luck.